We know what we want you to do, right? And there will be debate. Well, some want the government to do X, and some want the government to do Y. Some want the government to change X. Some don't want the government to change Y. We can go back and forth, right? But the thing is that we, the people, are by definition different, right? We're different. What we expect is for the institution, whether it's A or B, we expect the institution to be a representation of this diversity, right? This institution should be a representation of this diversity. Now, granted, obviously the job is difficult, right? Because the very nature of the institution is to speak on one accord, to consolidate that diversity into sort of a general account. And there's definitely nothing more difficult than doing that. However, it's important to recognize that the institution needs to tell the population what the expectations are, right? Map it out, explain it under the current status quo, whatever it is that we're addressing. It could be healthcare, it could be housing costs, it could be tax dollars, it could be energy, it could be whatever, right? The current status quo. Under this current status quo, you, the people, should recognize that we, the institution, have expectations, right? We expect that you understand the difference between existing and pre-existing. We expect, the institution expects that you understand the importance of water conservation or the benefits of nuclear energy or whatever it might be, right? What are the expectations, right? So that in a sense, the people recognize what they can do to contribute or not to contribute. And why is this important, right? Why is any of what I just said important? Well, it leads me to the next point of service, right? It leads to the next point of service. There are many in the Democratic Party are just extremely upset with Republicans, and they say, oh, you know, Republicans, the problem with Republicans is that they're obstructionists, right? They're trying to prevent change from happening. And anyone who tries to prevent change from happening is bad, and change is good. Well, it's not always the case that change is good, right? Change is not always good. And being an obstructionist is not always bad, right? Sometimes you do need to obstruct. Sometimes you do need to say, hey, what is this new policy that you're trying to implement? Because as I said earlier, you recognize the direct relationship between policy and expectation. Where policies change expectation, there's going to be different demands from the population. Where there are different demands from the population, the institution is going to have to address those demands. So that policy is really the crux of this all. So obviously, those who have control over making policy, right, may obstruct policy. But what hasn't been addressed, what I don't think Democrats understand, is the role that service plays, right? And you know, John F. Kennedy famously talked about not what the government can do for you, but what can you do for the government, right? And the question is, well, how does this connect? I don't see how this connects, this idea of service. How does that connect to this paradigm shift, right? How does service, the notion of service, connect to the paradigm shift? If the people understand clearly what they can do in order to change the paradigm, if they really do want to change this paradigm, if they really do want change, what is it that the population can do to change? Then we recognize that service, right, the ability to serve, since we're talking about a paradigm, and we'll just label this, we'll go, because you know I'm an optimist, we'll go for A and B, not A or B. If this is where we're trying to get, right, where elements of the current status quo are preserved, and elements of the new paradigm are incorporated, if that's what happens, then we have to recognize that the change doesn't just come from the institutional change, right? It's not just institutional change. What ends up happening is the diversity of the population, so here's the population. We have to recognize that the policies enacted by this, so policy, The policies are enacted to affect the population. It's a matter of influencing the population. Policies are obviously put into place to affect, to control, to direct the population. Not only are they put in place to direct the population, but the population should recognize, the people should recognize that they have power, we, the people, have power to change the institutional support for these policies, right? But even that is still superficial. Because at this point, and we'll just label this 1 now, let's label that point 1, with respect to policy, you can have a paternalistic, P-A-T-E-R-N-A-L-I-S-T, you can have paternalistic policy, right? So I'm not going to get into a huge argument on this, but this is all background stuff. The classic example of some paternalistic policy might be the fact that you have to wear, and I'm not arguing for or against, I'm just, this is just fact. In driving a car, you have to wear a seatbelt. In riding a motorcycle, you have to either have a helmet on or have at least like goggles on. It's like, why should the government tell me that I have to wear a seatbelt, right? I don't care about wearing a seatbelt. If I hit a tree and I'm ejected from the car and I die because of it, shouldn't I have the right to do that myself? Why is the government telling me to put on a seatbelt, right? It seems paternalistic. We the people don't like the government telling us what we need to do for our own good. And the counter argument to that is that, listen, we don't really care if you want to kill yourself, right? You're right. We shouldn't regulate things that are for your own good. I'm not the father, you're not the kid, do what you want. However, you do recognize that when your body is ejected from the car and it slams into somebody else's car, that you become a projectile, right? And we're trying to protect that other person. We don't really care if you want to die, but we're trying to protect that other person. You do also recognize that your body being a projectile, right, thrown from the car, hitting another car, is doing damage to that other car, right? So we want to protect the property of the person driving that car, right? And so on and so on and so forth. So there's an argument that goes over this policy. If it's the case that the policy is paternalistic, there's going to be a lot more resistance by the population. And surprisingly enough, I haven't heard anyone ask Republicans, do they perceive this? And the reason why they're resisting, for example, the idea of preventative or pre-existing situations, is the attempt to cover pre-existing situations, is it paternalistic, right? Now that's a discussion I'd love to have, right? That's a discussion I'd love to see on television, right? The people should have a certain amount of responsibility. It's not the government's role to protect the people from themselves per se, right? And who really is being affected? Now I don't necessarily believe either of these. I'm just trying to argue for both parts, right? Who really is to say that the government should protect and should allow for someone's recklessness or someone's lack of coverage to affect the overall cost of the healthcare community as such? Isn't that a bit paternalistic? If that's the argument, that's a fair argument, right? And I think, within the media or within intellectual life or on the streets at the corner shops or the coffee places, people can get engaged in that discussion. But just to say that we obstruct for the sake of obstructing is, I think, not to give credit to obstructionism, right? Obstructionism is a tool, right? And it's not a tool. Obstructionism is a tool of protecting, right? Of safeguarding the status quo, which is not to say that obstructionism is necessarily in all defense of the status quo, because of the idea of paradigm shifts, right? The second thing to recognize